I want to introduce Sheila O'Donnell, who's our keynote speaker for today. And Sheila is the founding director of O'Donnell Tuomey Architects. She graduated from University College Dublin in 1976 and spent 5 years in London working for Spence and Webster, Colquhoun and Miller, and staying Stirling and Partners and studying for an MA in Environmental Design at the Royal College of Art. In 1981, she returned to Dublin to teach at UCD in Start and Practice. She co-founded O'Donnell Tuomey with John Tuomey in Dublin in 1988. The practice has designed cultural, social and educational buildings at home and abroad. They've designed master plans on university campuses in Ireland, the UK and on the European mainland. Winners of more than 120 awards. Recent buildings include the LSE Student Centre in London, the Central European University Budapest, the Glucksman Gallery in Cork, Timberyard Housing Dublin, Irish Language Centre Derry, O'Casey Community Centre Dublin, the Lyric Theatre in Belfast, and the Photographers Gallery in London. They've exhibited 6 times at the Venice Architectural Biennale. They've designed a new museum for the V&A in V&A East, and a dance theatre and academy for Sadler's Wells, both currently under construction in East London. She taught at University College Dublin for 40 years, where she was practice professor in architecture until 2019. She has taught and lectured widely in Europe, Japan, the USA. In 2015, with her partner John Tuomey, she received the FRIBA Royal Gold Medal and the American Academy of Arts and Letters Brunner Prize, both awarded in recognition of a lifetime's work in architecture. Sheila was named Architect of the Year at the 2019 Women in Architecture Awards for her work on the Central European University in Budapest, Hungary. And in 2019, she was elected a foreign honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Her watercolours have been exhibited in the Royal Academy of the Royal Irish Academy, and she is an elected member of Isadonna, the affiliation of Irish artists. And it's my very real pleasure to welcome Sheila here today. And I'll invite her to deliver her talk today. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Could I have a glass of water, please? A glass of water.
Sure. Just go upstairs. I'll get you
Thanks. Thank you, Frank. It's a pleasure to be here today in this company to reflect on Tim Robinson and his work and its effect on all of us, I think, who are working with landscape and visual and cultural and historical matters. I apologise if my talk might end up being a bit sentimental about Tim and Mairead, but as Fidelma said, I think all of us who knew them feel at moments like this a real sense of loss. My own relationship, you might say, with Tim and Mairead and their house in Roundstone has 4 stages. I mean, the first stage being my understanding and knowledge of Tim's work. Maybe in particular, actually, Finola mentioned that we used to go to the Aran Islands with students when I was teaching in UCD architecture. And Tim's maps, well, his map at that stage of Aran and his books were a hugely important part of our understanding of the place. In fact, I don't know if it was the year that we went with you, Finola, it might have been another year. The first time I met him, I called at the house in Roundstone in about 1990 to ask if he would come to Aran and talk to our students, and he very politely refused, saying, "No, I've done with Aran for now I'm in Connemara." But he did ask myself and my colleague Rachel in to see where he's working on the map of Connemara, which was just a wonderful moment of seeing his work, but also it was my first encounter with that incredible room low down at the end of the pier, which always felt like the sea was just about to come up around your feet as you were in there, sort of smell of damp, and even then. So my second stage of my relationship was getting into the house. I felt I really knew his house from that wonderful essay, A House on a Small Cliff, which Tim wrote, I think, again, or I'm not sure when he wrote it, was published in the Irish Times, and then in My Time in Space. But getting into the house, which really occurred through John and I were invited to contribute to the Roundstone Conversations in 2006. And through that, we formed a friendship with Tim and Mairead, which survived to the end of their lives. And out of that, the third layer of my relationship was when we came to design feasibility study for the transformation of the house into what they called a research centre, but I think it was like a combination of research centre and a kind of gathering house, a place for people to meet and talk. And then the fourth stage is following their sad demise just about 3 years ago. I think we're about halfway between their 2 anniversaries now. When, after they died, I just, during the lockdown, walking up and down the canal in Dublin, felt really distressed when I heard that the university had turned down the bequest for the house and decided that I would have to do something. And so I formed a working group to set up a campaign to save the house and to have it brought into some use to do with culture and the memory of them and their lives in that place. 3 years on, not a huge amount of progress has been made, except that the house itself is secured. And so I worked with Tim's nephew, John Drever, who's the executor of the will, and we're still working on that, and I'll talk about that. The project for the Robinson Centre, or as they called it, the Folding Landscape Centre, was really important to Tim and Mairead, conscious as they were of the significance of the site of the house in the history and culture of Roundstone. This is an amazing photograph, which actually John Drever, Tim's nephew, recently gave me, and I apologise to the Nave Aina Facebook site, which I think it came from. But it's a fantastic photograph that situates the house, which was once a longer building, as you can see here, and which backed onto what looked like lazy beds, so it was obviously a productive landscape in Roundstone. And they were very conscious. I mean, they didn't know the details of the history, but they were conscious that the stores where Nimmo kept his supplies while he was building the pier in the village were on this site, that the airy room where Tim and Mairead conducted their lives was originally a district board lace-making school, later a knitting factory. And then, of course, for all of us, that the big room overlooking the sea, or the little room downstairs, which the sea sometimes comes into at high tide, is the place where Tim made his maps and wrote his books during their 30 years of occupation. And they described themselves as temporary caretakers of the house, and they believed that the house would go on and continue to have a use, significant cultural use in Ireland. I mean, maybe just to set the credentials for John, this first project that John and I ever did together was in 1977. It was competition for the IDA site, which in fact, coincidentally, is where Tim and Mairead first landed when they came to Roundstone. And so we made this project in response to an amazingly beautiful curved switchback wall on the Franciscan monastery site, keeping the tower in a very sort of formal rationalist project, which I think is probably still roughly how we would approach that place. And it was about picking up on the pier and the wall, etc. So we lived in London when we did this project, and those are the days when you didn't easily come back. So in working on the project and looking at the photos and the maps, we both drew on childhood holidays that we had had in Connemara and Roundstone as a kind of way of remembering the place and the character of the place. And maybe that was the first time that we consciously thought about how the physical sense of a place enters your memory, and that is an important part of your understanding and how you bring it forward. Sorry, the slides don't seem to be moving. And it was partly through a shared interest in place that our friendship with Tim and Mairead developed following that Roundstone conversation session. And as on so many other subjects, I would say that we have learned a lot from Tim Robinson about place. We discussed the subject a lot with him over many years, and we always came back to how central place is in our work and was in his. We agreed that the place is much more than a physical phenomenon. It includes aspects of time, culture, ethos, essence, and of course, society. We talked about how our buildings are designed from the ground up and the inside out. And in that context, we think of both ground and inside being aspects of place. When everything is in its place, everything is all right. It's good. So we think a lot about how to respond to particular characteristics of a site and how to make places within our buildings. Trying to understand the sense of place in a place or site is always a starting point. And also bringing to our work a sense of place learned from other places. And these are subjects which were very fruitfully and interestingly discussed with Tim. In A Land Without Shortcuts, he writes about the nature of place, about what makes a place out of a locality, what makes a place, as he says, so precious that we feel called upon to protect it. He describes in that essay 3 places that are precious to him, and he attributes to each a particular essence: beauty, strangeness, and antiquity, 3 fragile moments of place. He concludes that it is the basic act of attention that makes a place out of a location. And in those words, I think he summarised the task of an architect, to make places by bringing attention to a location. And obviously the location of their house, which is so amazing, and the end of the pier. And he talks about the kind of secret that it feels like a house on a pier, and then you come through and you discover the scale of the house and the landscape and the garden behind. And of course, in this room, beautifully captured by Mick O'Dea in this portrait of Tim in his place, is where we had all those conversations. So when we were finally invited in the door in 2006 to see the house in itself, we have a house across the bay, and Mairead particularly liked the times when we would come over by boat to visit. She always talked about us keeping the trade routes open between Callacrick, where we have our house, and their place. And then this room was such an amazing place. It's a really very beautiful room, and he describes it so wonderfully in his essay, House in a Small Cliff. And it's where those conversations took place. And the house, when they lived there, had this kind of bright, sparkling character about the light coming in the day, the stars and the moon at night. And although it was in kind of poor condition, it was, you can see in the photograph of the corridor, it was beautifully kept and loved by them and polished and full of things. Tim has a great phrase, I can't remember exactly, is that their skill as homemakers was something like the beautiful integration of the nasty, or because he said all their furniture was horrible, and they bought these horrible chairs, such as maybe some chairs his parents left him, and there was the kind of integration of the nasty into beauty was very important to him. And then, of course, there was the amazing secret of the garden, and the sense of that the garden had this kind of quiet haven where you could sit, as he said, any time when the wind was howling outside, you could sit in their forum. And the numerological garden, which Tim built painstakingly at a time when he was drawing the maps, and he would go out in the evenings to release his body from the hunching over the map and make this garden using concrete blocks and making this amazing geometrical square within a square within a square, which he saw as, in some way, I think he realised, or I believe it was a part of the process of making the map, and also as a kind of reflection of the limestone landscape of Arran. And I would say now that it's a site-specific artwork in parallel to his writings, to his cartography and his paintings, and it's part of the cultural legacy that he's left us, and it's part of a landscape in Roundstone which I think ought to be retained as part of Tim's work. So, and there they are. They had this little forum space with a semicircle of trees, and they're holding forths, imagining some Greek plays in the place. But over the years, visiting him, it was great the way they just used the house in so many ways. There was this pop-up exhibition of Tim's paintings, which came about because one winter, when they came back after the winter in London, they found all the paintings were getting stained by damp, so they kind of took them out and cleaned them up and then installed them around these rooms with the water, the feeling of the water coming in behind. We tried to buy one of his paintings at that stage, but he said he wanted to keep them all together, so they go to Emma. So instead he gave us this very beautiful drawing, which I just really love, because to me it sums up so many aspects of Tim. There's a kind of mathematical thing about the circles and the lines that connect them and the geometry. There's his art. There's something kind of philosophical and thoughtful about it, and it resonates with me as well as an architect who tries to work with shifts in geometry. I just want to talk a bit about another way in which he influenced me, I suppose, was about maps. I've always really loved maps. You might say I'm kind of a bit obsessed by maps. And so Tim's maps, when he made them, were a really interesting breakthrough. I suppose, I mean, Fionnuala has mentioned it, but the purpose of the map for him maybe was for him to understand and interpret Arran, and then subsequently, obviously, the Burn and Connemara. He felt he had to make a map to pull together physical form and features, culture and history and language, and that's obviously why he learnt Irish, was in order to understand the place names and to record them and to give them back to the Irish people with the feeling that the names had been stolen when the Ordnance Survey maps were made in the 19th century. So his map is a way for him, I think, of understanding and interpreting places, and also recording his own physical and temporal engagement with place. I'm just going to take a bit of a detour to talk about some of my own map obsessions. In order to understand Rome, whenever I visit Rome, which is, I hope, try to be once a year, I use an existing set of historic maps, which is the Nolly Plan of 1748, and I claim that map by marking on it the routes that I take every day, that I walk through the city, and I use a different colour pencil for each day. And it builds up a kind of diary, a record of my own experience in place and in space. And what I love about this map is that Nolly represented the city as a continuous physical entity. He distinguishes between public and private, but not between old and new. So I find that this map has a kind of physical presence. It describes the city as I experience it, and then my own marking on it makes it clear. For example, you can hardly see the Pantheon because there's so many lines on it, and every colour is in the Pantheon, because that's, you can work out where I stay by the thing. And I love Tim's description of his process, where he says, while walking the land, I am the pen on the paper. While drawing this map, my pen is myself walking the land. The purpose of this identification was to shortcut the polarities of objectivity and subjectivity, and to help me keep faith with reality. And I think those words were in my mind when I decided one year on a holiday on a Greek island to make a map of my daily swims. And I swam into the harbour every day, and I would line myself up on a cave on the rocky headland opposite, or wheel around a blue boat to face the open sea, and then I'd aim for a peak on a distant mountain range before turning back towards the ladder. And I marked the route I've taken on the map every day. It changes with every swim. Boats are added, moved or removed. The swims develop in response to the map, and I see myself suspended in aquatic space between the many fishing boats. As I move, I feel their shape and size because I've drawn them onto the blue-green watercolour sea. I adjust my route to check if that boat has really moved since yesterday, or if it's in alignment with that mountain monastery, or if the wind is coming up. And most years I would make a map, and recently I've been staying in a different part of the same island where there are no boats, so the most recent map isn't about, it's about views. So it's about where I'm looking at when I swim, and why I change my route to look at the monastery on the top of the mountain, or the Crusader Castle, or the gap in the headland. And in a way, I think this sense of making maps as a way of understanding place and space, and understanding the thing about doing it in water, means that I'm kind of recognizing as an architect that space is a fluid entity, and that sometimes people move in a not so orthogonal way between things. And I really believe that these maps have helped me to think about how to make space in new buildings. And the fourth aspect, I suppose, of mapping is that I have run a number of projects with architecture students from UCD in and around Tim's house. And the last one that I did with my partner John was we brought a group of thesis master's students down to make a project there. But the first thing we asked them to do was to map Tim's site, his house and his garden, and to use the level of intense close noticing that he uses in drawing the house. You can't see very clearly on this drawing, but the students drew everything in the room. They drew every bottle on a shelf, everything in his kitchen, the bedspread on the bed. And then they also mapped the garden. So the work that Tim did in the garden is all recorded on these very precise drawings, the numerological garden, all the little curvy paths, which I think is an important part of the move towards helping to somehow retain and conserve the place, is that it has been recorded in this way. And so they drew each level. This is the upper level, the living level of the house. You don't see it so well here, but I just wanted to focus in, and I don't know if you can read the words on the map. What's quite nice is as you zoom further in on this drawing the students made, that they've written, like he did in his map, always in English in this case, but they've written a description of what everything is. So it says bucket, I think it says casserole dish collecting rainwater, bucket collecting rainwater, 2 small wooden robins on a tray. So the task was to really go in and map the house and record it in words and in drawing. And it was a really good starting point for the work they did. One part of the survey, because of these amazing mirrors all over the house, they did a mirror survey, and they recorded all the mirrors that Tim and Mairead have, and they drew and measured and then took photographs of the mirrors. And then when Tim and Mairead came back from London, where they were when we were doing the survey, we had a kind of our own roundstone conversation. And you can see at least 3 of those mirrors in this drawing. And they were delighted with the students' survey work. And then the students went on to make design proposals for their house, some very radical, some very extreme. And there was such a fantastic response. They were so open-minded. Tim kept saying, you know, knock the whole place down, build a tower. I mean, one guy did a 10-story tower. I just love this photograph because it's Mairead. It's just so her. So that was a wonderful experience. And through working with the students and with Tim and Mairead and talking about potential was how we developed the brief for the project we made for the Folding Landscape Centre. So when we'd finished that project, you might say that, I just have to go back because this was the day, that maybe the last day we saw them before they went, was that they were waving at us as we went off in the boat. And they looked like a pair of cormorants standing up on this thing. So they, in a way, invited us into the house to then think about how would we move forward with it. And I suppose one thing you're very conscious when you're in that house is the views out the window and the sense of how it captures the water and captures the place. So I started by making sketches when we were there on the site and roughly using watercolour to describe the views in different directions and think about how the existing house would be exploited and how anything new would be developed to capture that sense of view and movement and to keep the sense of the kind of split between coming down the pier and then finding the garden and the spaces behind. And it happened that we were on that same Greek island where the swimming maps come from when we were making the design for this project. And I was drawing these different kinds of stones, a very dense obsidian and a very light tufa. And we were thinking about heavy and light and how the project might develop. And we just had pencils and sketch paper. So we started to develop the project, and on the sort of long bit, on the middle is the existing house, and this was John's, what you might call a sort of model made using objects to hand. So it's a sketch with coloured pencils representing, on the right, a building which would contain studios, and the lump of obsidian representing the meeting gathering house, and another little stone representing the moon room, and the pencil sharpener is the lift. So in a way, I think that sense of working on things, calling to mind one place when you're in another place is very interesting too, and it's very relevant to the work. So we came back and made a lot of models, including this concrete model, which is really of the place, about how the relationship between the pier and the cliff and the sea that there is. And then we made other paper models, all the time very conscious that they wanted to make something that was quite strong and had its own sense, but really belonged to that place and to that landscape and to the sea. And that because of where the site sits, the set of buildings is actually quite low-lying below the hill behind of the town of Roundstone. And so we made the existing house is the form at an angle on the right, which we kept as a kind of meeting room, cafe, socialising space. The proposal is that we would keep their library, which is this wonderful little space at the back with the stove and all the books, and then build a big new room for exhibitions, for gathering, for symposia. And on the left-hand side, with the boundary to the community hall, a little row of studios where artists or writers could come and research and work. And the big room has these roof lights that capture the light and the landscape and the sky, which of course is so important in Connemara. And the existing house is retained. And then, as you can see here, how it sits down on what Tim calls a small cliff at the bottom of the town, with these big roof forms expressed and sort of hanging into the land. And seen from the other side, from the community side, in the foreground is the building for the studios and the research centre. And we were trying to think about, it's a feasibility study, so it's not designed in detail, but we're very interested in the sense of how you might make something like this, how you might use the technology of boats, like we did to an extent in the Furniture College in Letterfrack, thinking about the roofs made out of big timber structure, how you might use what would be the equivalent of the sails of the hookers to make a sort of surface on the roofs, and then the weight that would have to be at the bottom to hold the building down to the land. And we imagined a kind of concrete earth made out of bits of shell and ground up stone from the site of Connemara. And Tim and Mairead were very happy with the proposal, and they wrote us a wonderful email in response Tim says, we're pleased beyond words with your vision of folding landscapes to be, savouring the way the unusual shapes and volumes arise, or so it seems, naturally and unaffectedly from the interplay of the unusual site and the ethos of its hoped-for future. An amazingly complex confection with more space inside it than Euclid allows. The general outline as seen from the harbour or the sea is very striking with its internalised horizons and gale-defying cloud hooks. Before I get carried away, let me say for both of us, you seem to have answered the question, not we, but the site proposed. The 12 pins will give it the nod. And I think for us to have answered the question that the site proposed is probably the most important thing. So this was submitted to the University Foundation in Galway, and then a kind of silence followed. And I think that was in 2016, and Tim and Mairead certainly were more and more anxious that they were not hearing anything from the university in response to their messages. And so we also were waiting for this to happen. And in 2018, when we were invited to contribute to the international part of the Venice Biennale, we made a proposal for what we called Folding Landscapes East and West. And it was a combination of two projects, but really it was about making a little pavilion which represented the project we had designed for the house, and building it as something that you could experience within an exhibition. And because we were, again, making the proposal for Venice in the same Greek island and in the mountains in the island, thinking about Greek chapels and how they sit. I mean, I think we find a lot of relationship between the landscape of Greece and the west of Ireland, about the rocks and the stones and the sense of connection people have. So we built this little half-scale model of the project for Roundstone as a way of kind of reminding ourselves and them. And in the end, they didn't make it out to Venice, but they took a lot of interest in the project, how we might make a place. And in fact, it became an exhibition in itself where the drawings for the project were exhibited. And I suppose that was our last built manifestation of this project. And I just wanted to sort of summarise by talking about where we are now and where we might go. In Tim's, the first essay I mentioned about the house on a small cliff, is just a really beautiful description of life in a house and how the qualities and characteristics of light and air and location work. The second essay he wrote, The Wind Through the House, some years later, is quite different. It has an undertone of anxiety and uncertainty about the house, about their lives, about their future connection to Connemara. I think that he's talking, as he often was, about that was the end of their relationship with Connemara and they were going to move on and do something else. But then the essay ends on an upbeat note, having resolved with NUIG that the house would continue as a place of intellectual exchange and study. And he says, we've begun to anticipate that future by opening up the house to such events. We feel relieved of the burden of ownership, as if we were now just the temporary caretakers of the house, and we revel in the freshening wind of futurity blowing through it, wafting away the spider webs of anxiety. Unfortunately, those webs of anxiety wafted right back in the last few years of their lives, spent in ill health in their small London flat, anxious that NUIG might not take the house as promised. And these two photographs of the room, I don't know, I think they're amazing. On the left is the room as it was when we all had the conversations with them. And on the right is the room, I don't know, maybe in 2020, 2021, one of the times I was in there trying to take a survey of the condition with their John Woods, who's the amazing man who looks after the house, with them standing there in the room and trees and weeds beginning to come in through the window. So when Emmett Scanlon, in his recent podcast series, asked me to answer the question, what do buildings do all day? My first response was that buildings wait and they remember. People can linger in the in-between spaces, waiting to be ready before entering slowly perhaps. And the building waits too for human activity, anticipates it, encourages the delayed response. Tim and Mairead Robinson's empty house in Roundstone is waiting now, waiting and remembering. The water that seeps up from the sea through the floors and pours from the sky down into the ceilings, is abundant in its evidence of abandonment. But the objects they left behind challenge these signs of neglect. The mirrors, carefully placed, still reflect the sea and sky into the room. The fossils on the windowsills continue to resonate. The artefacts themselves seem to question whether those old inhabitants are gone for good. Buildings hold sentiments, or perhaps our imaginations impose them. But these sentiments arise via powerful forces, subtly insinuated through structures and gradually instilled by sympathetic osmosis into us. I think that in some way, they're in that house, that place. And as we all stood on the pier last November, watching their ashes being rowed out to sea in those amazing bundles that Fidelma found the beautiful old boiled oil wool for, I turned to look at the house and I thought I could see them there on the terrace watching us all. Now we need to find a way to make their intentions somehow come to pass in the future of this house. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheila. That was wonderful. And we look forward to the next, whatever happens after the house has been waiting. I'm going to ask if anybody wants to say anything in response to the presentation. We've got a few minutes. Does somebody want to add something to that? What's going to happen?
That's the big question. Actually, I should have said that the campaign that we've been, I suppose it was very difficult to start a campaign in the middle of the lockdown, but John Drever, Tim's nephew, and myself, I suppose, were the people who started this, and then we worked with Bill and Denise Whelan were very involved, John Fanning, more recently Nessa and Dan Carey from the Moore Institute and Emer O'Connor. We've been, in a sense, my aspiration was, ideally I would love to see the centre that Tim and Mairead wanted happening there. But at the very least, I would like to feel that the house itself would be saved and somehow restored and repaired, that the garden would be brought back to life, and that it would be accessible to people as a place to visit, as a place. There's so many, it seems Connemara doesn't have a place, a centre for people to gather, to get information. If obviously the maps are being reprinted, and we'll hear about that, it would be a place from which the maps could be sold, information. So in my sense, it could go either from the ideal, which is the full research centre being built, and we're continuing to talk to educational institutions. I think some people are here from the Atlantic Technological University. They're, I think, quite interested, because all of the universities teach Tim's work, and they all have departments which deal with his work ranges from, geography, geology, cartography, through philosophy, through mathematics, through art, through literature. So and I think that his work is going to become more relevant, not less relevant. So I suppose I just really hope that now that the lockdown is over and we're all trying to get our energy back, that there's some way that the institutions can come together and to make something happen that means the house continues to be used, and that the amazing place that he made there is somehow retained. It was when we did the projects with the students, and Tim kept saying, "Just knock the house down." I said, "That's wrong, Tim." It was right for him to be able to say it, but I think for us, that I don't think that's really an option. I think the house, but unfortunately, the room where he drew the maps was an extension built on. You can see in that amazing aerial photograph at the beginning that part wasn't there, and that would have to be demolished because it's just really badly built, and that's the bit that the water is coming up and coming down through. But the core of the house itself, where the big room is, which is really where the ideas unfolded and where the work that they did took place, is definitely savable. And so, if anyone has any ideas or any money, I think the challenge, oddly, is not so much capital funding, not that we have found much, but I think the challenge is finding someone to run the place and to actually keep it up and to pay for the running of it. There is money around Connemara, and so if all we were trying to do was raise funds to build something, that would probably be easier than just actually finding a meaningful use that would continue. So I think that's the challenge, and that's what we are trying to ask people who are interested in Connemara. Or actually, there's one quote, I mean, because it goes way beyond Ireland. So I have Robert Macfarlane said a very beautiful thing, probably around the time after Tim died. He said, "From this house in Roundstone, over decades, Tim Robinson carried out one of the most remarkable place-writing projects ever conceived in any language or culture. A deep mapping of the west of Ireland that will endure as a masterpiece for centuries to come. The house was the site of so much of this work's making and thinking, its cognitive centre of gravity. As such, it is indivisible from Tim's achievement." And I think that that's true. I think that that's why there, the sense that even the way he worked the garden, that he's in the house. So it's 3 years now, and I think you go through periods of just being despairing about it. And I think recently, Frank and everybody, Liz, who are organising this event, I found it was a useful way of kind of getting a bit of enthusiasm and energy back, having felt deflated somehow about it. So it needs input from people who care about the work and who believe and understand that Tim's work is a remarkable record, a description of a place. I mean, the fact that someone came from England and explained to us Irish people how to understand our own landscape is just, or understand any landscape, because I think it is applicable beyond. So it's a long answer to what's going to happen. I don't know. Something, I hope.
Okay. I just have a question as to maybe why nothing happened while they were living. If you had your first meeting with them in 2006.
Oh, well, it was.
Was it never a possibility to develop the house while they were living?
Well, it did develop in the sense that it was, and he wrote about that as well. It was 2006 was when they left the house or the year that NUIG accepted the donation of the house, and were very enthusiastic about that. And that's the basis on which the Roundstone conversations were started. So they were a collaboration between the Robinsons and the university. So, and he wrote about the reason for doing that was that they were imagining in the future when they were gone, the house would be used by lots of people. And he said, well, we wanted to be there ourselves when it was being used. So in a sense, when they lived there, because, the photographs I showed show that it felt kind of clean and fine because they were just maintaining it. There were always buckets in a corner collecting little bits of rain, but it was kind of polished and you didn't really notice that. So it was their house, they were living there. So they couldn't, it wasn't really appropriate to start doing work around them. But they believed, I know that Tim felt the legacy of the archive and the house were one legacy. In his mind, they were one and the same thing. And in fact, he wrote about how parts of the archive would probably almost inevitably end up back in the house. So, he wasn't, in 2006, he felt happy that there was a solution and that, while they lived there, they would just live there in their slightly cold and, damp house, but that it would eventually, when they were gone, be when the place was transformed. So they believed they were, that the fact of those events occurring, which were collaborations with the university, that it had already, in a sense, passed over to the college. But it turned out that it hadn't.
Yeah, I just have one other short question. What's NUIG's position now, I wonder? What's their attitude towards the project now?
There's a place in Cambridge called the Kettleyard.
Yeah.
And it really reminds me of that.
Yeah.
And it's like a living museum now to the people who used to work and live there. And it seems to me that could be a kind of a template for how to go forward, to build a trust. And there's a lovely exhibition centre there as well.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And this lady here saying it was a place that the Tim and Mairead loved, Kettleyard.
Yeah, it's a really super place.
The thing about it is, I think it probably had a foundation with a very strong legacy funding. I think there was funding that came with it when it was set up. That's the challenge in a sort of quiet outpost in the west of Ireland, is finding...
Sheila, maybe I make a few brief comments, because those of us here who worked at the university are deeply ashamed of what happened, and staff in the university put an enormous amount of time into preparing plans and strategic objectives for the Robinsons and for their centre and for the academic use of the place. And what happened was deeply regrettable. What needs to happen now is that the house, the structure in Roundstone, needs to be given a legal entity and perhaps a trust set up. And I think once that legal element is clarified and there's a structure there are many people in the west of Ireland, from Ashford down, who will be very willing, one hopes, to participate in the work of this Roundstone Trust. So I think a legal start would be a very good start.
And in a sense, that's because the house, it's only in the last couple of months that the will, the probate on the will has finally been resolved, and John Drever is now the owner of the house. So the next step is to set up a trust, and we're just trying to decide exactly what the structure of that is and who's going to be in it.
Thanks very much.
Just wondering why.